Thanks, Louise. Thank you, Fiona, for this opportunity. 20 years ago, this would never have happened. And it's something I never imagined would happen in my lifetime. So I'm really chuffed. I begin by acknowledging all the traditional owners of everywhere that we're talking about. And it's really important, I think, that the research that we do uncovers these stories and gives voices to all the victims who are silenced. Tracking Samuel Griffith in the archives. In 1840, the Parliament of New South Wales passed legislation declaring it shall not be lawful for any Aboriginal native or half-caste, usually abiding with such natives, to have or keep any kind of firearms or ammunition. A fine of £25 would be levied on any person supplying any kind of firearms or ammunition whatsoever to any Aboriginal, native or half-caste. I've looked, but I never found an exemption for that act when the Native Police came into being in 1848. But 4 decades later, I found this letter in the State Archives. And it's from the police magistrate at Ingham, up past Townsville, and he's writing to Brisbane to the Colonial Secretary. There have been complaints of firearms in possession of the blacks, including several discharged native police troopers. One grazier wrote, "It seems hard to believe that anyone who presumably knows the treacherous nature of all blacks could act in so inconsiderate a manner." Colonisers were afraid of armed Aboriginal men, especially those who had been in the native police. The Queensland Attorney General at the time was Charles Chubb, and he commented, and you can just read it on this, "There is no law that I am aware of which prohibits blacks to carry firearms. All I can suggest is to take the weapons away from them by force if necessary, and make them some compensation for the deprivation." But before anything could be done, there was a general election and nothing happened for the next month. Eventually, the letter is forwarded to the Commissioner of Police, David Seymour, and he replies, and you can just read it on the halfway down the page, "It will not be an easy matter to disarm the blacks. Lives will probably be taken. Am I justified in going so far if necessary?" The colony's newly appointed Colonial Secretary, a Welshman named Samuel Griffith, declared, "Life must not be taken or endangered, but the arms must be got if possible." He also ordered his subordinates to prepare a bill to forbid the supplying of arms to Aborigines. I found no trace of this actually becoming law, but it's a really interesting early illustration of Samuel Griffith's thinking. Even though he does know the difference between murder and what is a British subject, he's quite happy to make one law for white people and another law for blacks. And that really becomes an issue throughout his career. I think this episode adequately illustrates some of the problems we encountered tracking Samuel Griffith in the archives. I'd still like to find more comments on this topic from him. I think I've found a lot of records, but I'm still finding more each time I go there. Quite apart from the standard research challenges, such as the one-sided accounts, the missing records, the convoluted bureaucratic paper trails, we often have to interpret his thoughts, intentions and attitudes from scant, illegible notations and carefully crafted legal documents. And that's Samuel Griffith's comments at the very bottom of the page, a little chicken scratching. I can read about half of his. It's abbreviated, it's sometimes impossible, but a lot of the times we can actually work out what he's thinking. My research for this paper on Sam Griffith's footprints in the archives has been hampered by a shortage of time. I only had a few weeks to do this in and a woeful lack of resources. I've been doing this on my own for the last 25 years. It'd be great to have a team. We really need a lot of skilled investigators to accurately and comprehensively track frontier violence in Queensland. Much more is needed. We have to be careful that we're not judging the past by the values of the present day, so that's another issue. But you also need people with highly developed skills in deciphering of abbreviated comments such as this, who can read against the grain, because there are voices of Aboriginal people in the records, you just have to find them. So instead of trying to do the whole of Griffith's career, I just want to focus on 3 important cases that he was involved in. How do I go? Yeah. Okay. The first one is 1874, the Palmer River Gold Rush, and he's one of my candidates. Alfred Davidson was the sole Queensland representative of the Aborigines Protection Society in London, which actually began as an anti-slavery body. And Davidson wrote repeatedly to the Queensland government saying you should have a royal commission, you should stop killing Aboriginal people. I think Davidson University sounds pretty good too. And he wrote in 1874, I consider it my duty to direct your attention to the published admission of a writer in the Telegraph paper that he and others have shot a lot, that is, committed murder of Her Majesty's subjects, who the Aborigines are as much under the protection of British law as we are ourselves. So here is one man who actually recognises common humanity. Davidson's letter is forwarded to the newly appointed Attorney General, guess what, Samuel Griffith, for his opinion. And he immediately tried to get the name of the letter writer out of the editor of the Telegraph. The Telegraph refused to divulge the identity. The police magistrate in Cooktown went and interviewed people who'd been on the first expedition to the Palmer. All agreed they did nothing more than they would be required to do again in similar circumstances. Killing Aboriginal people was a very normal activity. Griffith did nothing. Instead, and this is a minute from the Executive Council, they actually authorised extra police. That's the response. You know, there's been Aboriginal people killed, well, we better get some more police. And interestingly, Parliament was prorogued for nearly a year straight after that. So there's no discussion of the killings. And that's the second half of that page. The next case I want to talk about is the trial of Frederick Wheeler in 1876. I spent a lot of time looking at Frederick Wheeler. He's probably one of the most extreme members of the Native Police, but I'm also quite fascinated by how much I've been able to find about him. Jemmy, a young Aboriginal man, died at Diddley Station near Clermont in central Queensland in March 1876. The complaint against him was actually laid by another police officer, George Dias, and he presented it to the police magistrate, George Murray, who was also a former Native Police officer. And George Murray sends a telegram to the Attorney General, Samuel Griffith, requesting instructions. Samuel Griffith replied, I direct that Mr. Wheeler be prosecuted for the willful murder of Jemmy. Inform the Colonial Secretary accordingly. Wheeler was arrested on the 2nd of April and committed for trial at Rockhampton. Davidson wrote to the Aborigines Protection Society in England soon afterwards, saying, Wheeler was admitted to bail. I take it now the case is over. Of course, if he has any sense at all, he will forfeit his bail, rather than run a strong chance of being hung. And Frederick Wheeler is one of the few native police officers charged with murder. So that's what's so important. The sureties for Wheeler's release from the Rockhampton prison in today's money would be the equivalent of $110,000. The brief against Wheeler was signed True Bill by Samuel Griffith in September 1876, but literally 1 week later, Wheeler failed to appear at court. He was called 3 times, his sureties were entreated, and he did a run. The Cooktown Courier observed, "We all know it is ridiculous to expect a white man to be hanged for the murder of a black in Queensland." But the paper then went on to say, "This is how our colony is made to stink in the nostrils of all civilised people. The dastardly and murderous cruelties that are committed on the Aboriginals constantly and with absolute impunity are disgraceful to our common humanity." So there are newspapers actually calling this out. There is a postscript to the Wheeler case. 3 years later, the then Attorney General decided that a nolle prosequi should be entered because Wheeler had failed to appear and no bench warrant was ever applied for and no steps had been taken in the matter. In other words, Griffith did nothing. And that seems to be much more the case rather than Griffith doing things. Obviously, Wheeler's absconding on a murder charge was not seen as important. And I actually did manage to track him, and I do know what happened to him. It's really interesting because for the rest of the 19th century, the newspapers never forgot Griffith's part in Wheeler's escape. There was a celebrated court case in 1884 where 2 Europeans are convicted of murdering Melanesians, South Sea Islanders. And the Europeans throughout Queensland hold public meetings to argue for clemency. Griffith had recently replaced Thomas McIlwraith as Premier, and Brisbane newspapers reminded the public of Griffith's role in the Wheeler affair. The Brisbane Courier, the forerunner of the Courier Mail, stated, "Wheeler, that atrocious murderer, was allowed to leave the colony after being permitted to go free on bail, and no real attempt was ever made to stop or recover him." The newspaper continued, "Were there no police in Queensland to watch the murderer and follow him when he left the colony, to hunt him if necessary to the ends of the earth? Where could he have gone to escape from the clutches of the law if the Queensland government had been determined to recover him? The government of the day took no effective steps either to stop or recover this murderer. It was a government of which Mr. Griffith was a leading member, and it remained in power for 3 years after Wheeler's escape, and during the whole of that time there was no effort made to catch him. Griffith, the paper decided, neglected to bring Wheeler to the gallows, which he so richly deserved." The third case I'd like to talk about is the Urbanbank Massacre in 1884, and it's one of the very few massacres in Queensland that has been fully investigated, and a team of amateur historians and archaeologists actually located the site of this massacre on the Atherton Tablelands. I think if we did have a frontier violence museum, it would be so good if there were archaeologists who could go and find these murder sites and investigate them. That's what's happened in North America. That's what's happened in other former empires. In 1881, Sub-Inspector Henry Kay of the Native Police became one of the very small number of officers who was killed in the line of duty. His death was reported by his subordinate officer, William Nichols. He told the Commissioner of Police, I'm taking Mr. K's detachment and my own out after the murderers. He later reported that he had confined his collisions to the mob concerned in the murder. And collision is like dispersal, it means killing. 1 year later, Nichols was transferred to Herberton, ordered to patrol the Atherton Tablelands and adjacent districts. Warrants were issued for the arrest of 2 Aboriginal men accused of murdering 2 European stockmen about 150 kilometres away. Nichols takes his detachment of native police to a small mining town named Irvinbank, and he lets the troopers go out on their own. They're out all day. Next day, the reports come in that they have massacred a whole camp of people, men, women and children. More than 50 Europeans witnessed the bodies. The troopers came back the very next night and burned the bodies and got rid of it. But the people who did this investigation in the early 80s managed to find so much material on this one site that makes me think much more could be done researching frontier violence. But to return to Irvinbank, Sam Griffith ordered that Nichols be suspended and the troopers dismissed. The Attorney General at the time was Arthur Rutledge, and he wrote to Griffith saying, "It is pretty clear from these depositions that these Aboriginals have been barbarously murdered by native troopers." Griffith responded, "I do not see much chance of success in a prosecution." And of course the issue is the evidence. It's got to be first-hand witnesses, and at that stage it's got to be first-hand European witnesses, because Aboriginal evidence is not really kosher. There are questions asked in the Parliament, and Griffith responds, and it's lovely weasel words: "The government will take such steps as is possible to take in the matter, and the honourable member may be sure that they will not allow any atrocities of that kind to go unpunished, if it be in their power to punish those who are guilty of them." However, the House voted against a further investigation. And again, the newspapers remembered Frederick Wheeler. The Queensland Figaro published a wonderful article headed "Sam Griffith in the Dock." "I hereby solemnly impeach Samuel Walker Griffith, Premier of Queensland, with being the aider and the abettor of murders so foul that a hideous hell is let upon the land wherein they are contemplated. I impeach him with having winked at the escape of a wealthy murderer whose black heart was shown to have had no pity, and the recital of whose black deeds affright the imagination. I empanel the public of Queensland as my jury, and in the name of justice, of humanity, of everything that is not dastardly, cruel and murderous, do I demand of that public to judge between Mr. Griffith and me, his accuser." Of course, we have a north-south divide. Up in North Queensland, most local residents felt sympathy for Nichols. And when the charges against him were finally dismissed in court due to the lack of evidence, there were cheers in the courtroom. The Commissioner of Police recommended that the camp that those particular native police had come from be broken up, and the troopers were then put on trial, charged with murder. One senior police officer wrote asking if the troopers could be re-employed if they were released at court, because they were really smart troopers and we need them. Griffith replied, "I have already directed their dismissal and I'm surprised at the suggestion being put before me." So you get a little bit of an insight into the tension going on between senior police and the politicians. The case against the troopers was dropped when the Justice of the Supreme Court decided they did not clearly understand what murder meant. As is the case with most of Queensland's colonial politicians, proving genocidal intent is difficult because documents specifically ordering the extermination or killing of Aboriginal people are not so easily found. The archival records do, however, clearly show evidence of Griffiths' culpable neglect and callous indifference. And according to Roger Joyce, his biographer, Aboriginal problems were certainly not central to Griffiths' administration, for he probably shared the view of many of his contemporaries that problems would soon vanish. And in March 1892, another person who thought Aboriginal people would disappear soon, journalist Archibald Meston, declared, "No man living knows Sir Samuel better than I do. He is a lonely man, a stranger in a crowd, a sojourner among his friends. His faith in mankind is small, his contempt boundless." Under the Queensland Separation Bill, which would have divided Queensland into 3 separate colonies, introduced in July 1892, legislation relating to Aboriginal people was to be left to the 3 separate provinces, not the Queensland government. In other words, it was somebody else's problem, not Samuel Griffiths. Thank you.